Marta Ezra was 21 years old when her life split in two. Not with a scream, not with broken dishes or slammed doors. It happened quietly, the way the worst things usually do. She came home early from work one afternoon. Her shift at the law firm's reception desk had ended an hour ahead of schedule because one of the partners had canceled a string of appointments, and she let herself into the apartment she shared with her fiancé, Tyler Marsh, with her key, her own key, the one he had given her 6 months before when he got down on one knee in the parking lot of a restaurant neither of them could really afford. She did not call out his name when she walked in. She was tired. She was thinking about what to make for dinner. She was thinking about nothing at all, really, the way you think about nothing when your life feels settled and ordinary and safe. The bedroom door was not fully closed. She pushed it open. What she saw did not register at first. Her brain processed the image in pieces, the way it does when reality is too far outside what you expected. Tyler, the bed, a woman's dark hair spread across the pillow. And then her brain caught up, and she recognized the hair. It belonged to her sister, Diana. Diana was 20 years old. She had their mother's cheekbones and their father's stubbornness, and a laugh that filled every room she walked into. She had always been the one people noticed first. That was simply the way things were, and Marta had long since made her peace with it. She loved her sister. She had never had any reason not to. Until that moment, Tyler saw her first. He went white. He opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Diana turned her head slowly, and when she saw Marta standing in the doorway, something passed across her face that Marta would spend years trying to name. It was not quite shame. It was not quite defiance. It was something in between, something complicated and unfinished, like a sentence that had been stopped before it reached its point. Marta did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not throw anything, though there was a lamp on the nightstand that her fingers found and then released. She stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably no more than 30 seconds, and then she turned around and walked back out of the apartment. She sat in her car for a while. She watched the clouds move across the sky above the parking lot. Then she drove to a diner 3 blocks away and ordered coffee she didn't drink, and sat there until the sun went down, and then she drove back to her parents' house. She told them what she had found. Her father went quiet in the way he always went quiet when he didn't know what to say. Her mother pressed her lips together and looked at the table. And then, after a long pause, her mother said something that Marta would remember for the rest of her life. She said, "The heart doesn't always choose who we want it to choose." Marta looked at her mother for a moment. Then she nodded, slowly, as if she understood. And then she went upstairs to the room she had grown up in, and she packed 2 bags, and she left. She did not leave a note. There was nothing she wanted to say that she could put into words. She moved to Portland. She had a college friend there, a woman named Irene, who had a spare room and the good sense not to ask too many questions. Irene made tea at night and let Marta sit on the couch and stare at the wall when that was what she needed, and asked only enough questions to know she was all right. Marta was not all right, but she was functioning, which was close enough. She found a job at a small real estate office within her first week. The work was not glamorous. Answering phones, filing contracts, keeping the calendar of a harried agent named Robert Fenn, who forgot appointments twice a week and always apologized with the same tired smile. But it kept her busy, and busy was what she needed. She enrolled in evening classes at the community college 3 months after she arrived. Real estate law, contract fundamentals, property management principles. She studied at the kitchen table after Irene went to bed, with a mug of chamomile tea cooling at her elbow, the textbooks spread open around her like a paper fortress. She had always been good at understanding how things worked. Systems, structures, the logic underneath complicated arrangements. It had been one of the things Tyler used to tease her about, gently, the way you tease someone whose quirks you find endearing. He used to call her the most organized person he had ever met. He used to say it like a compliment. She tried not to think about Tyler. She mostly succeeded. What she found, in the absence of everything she had lost, was a kind of clarity she had not expected. Without the apartment, without the relationship, without the family dinners and the shared plans and the future that had seemed so certain, she could see herself more plainly than she ever had before. She was capable. She was precise. She worked harder than almost anyone she knew. And she wanted something, something real, something that was entirely hers. She wanted to understand property, not just the paperwork of it, but the logic of it, the way land and buildings held value, the way ownership worked, the way a piece of the world could be yours in a way that nothing and no one could simply take away. She got her real estate license at 23. She passed the bar exam for property law in the state of Oregon at 25, having spent 2 years completing her undergraduate degree part-time while working full-time at Robert's office. Robert, who was not a sentimental man, shook her hand when she told him and said, "I always thought you were smarter than this job." She took it as the compliment he intended. By 27, she had her own small practice. 2 employees, a modest office on the 3rd floor of a building on Morrison Street with a window that looked out over the river. She specialized in property disputes, contract negotiations, and real estate acquisitions for small investors. She was not rich, but she was building something, brick by brick, in the methodical, unhurried way that she approached everything. She did not go back to her parents' house during those years. She sent cards at Christmas and called on birthdays, keeping her voice light and her words careful, keeping the distance that everyone seemed to have silently agreed upon. Diana and Tyler had gotten married. She knew this from her mother, who mentioned it once and then did not mention it again. They had settled in a city 2 hours south. They seemed, by all outward appearances, to be living a normal life. Marta did not think about them often. When she did, it was not with the sharp, specific pain of the first year. It was something duller and more distant, like a scar that no longer hurt, but had never quite disappeared. She was not bitter. She told herself this, and after a while, she believed it. What she felt was something more complicated than bitterness, a kind of watchfulness, a patience without urgency, as if she had learned to let time do the work she could not do herself. And time, in its way, was working. It was Robert Fenn who first told her about the Greenfield portfolio. He called her on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 years after she had left his office, when she was sitting at her desk reviewing a contract dispute between 2 neighbors over a shared driveway. He still thought of her, he said, when something interesting crossed his desk, and this was interesting. A property management company based in Sacramento was selling off a collection of residential properties across 4 cities in the Pacific Northwest: Portland, Salem, Eugene, and one small cluster in a city called Millhaven, 2 hours south of Portland. The properties were well maintained, modestly priced, and the seller needed a quick close. The portfolio was being offered at slightly below market value because the company had already pivoted to commercial real estate and simply wanted the residential holdings off their books. Marta listened carefully. She asked the right questions. She looked at the numbers. She bought 4 of the 12 properties in the portfolio. It stretched her finances past the point of comfort. She spent 3 weeks barely sleeping, running projections, checking and rechecking her calculations, consulting with a financial advisor who told her she was being aggressive, and then, after looking at the numbers again, told her she was probably right to be. The properties in Millhaven were the ones that made her pause. There were 2 of them, a small house and a ground-floor apartment unit in a quiet residential building on Caldwell Street. She almost passed on them. Millhaven was not a city she knew, and 2 hours was a manageable distance, but not a convenient one. But the numbers were good. The rental history was solid, and there was something about the location, a stable neighborhood, a low vacancy rate, a kind of dull reliability that experienced investors learn to recognize and value. She filed the paperwork, hired a local property manager, and turned her attention back to her other work. The properties went onto the rental market. Tenants were found. Checks arrived on the first of every month. It became, in time, simply part of the background hum of her life, a reliable, unexamined piece of the portfolio she was quietly assembling. She did not know, when she signed the deed on the Caldwell Street apartment, that her sister and Tyler Marsh had been living there for 3 years. She found out 6 months later, when her property manager sent her the standard annual tenant summary and she opened the file on a Sunday morning over coffee. She read the name on the lease twice: Diana Marsh, Tyler Marsh. She set her coffee cup down. She sat very still for a long time, looking at the names on the screen of her laptop. The morning light came through the window at a low angle and made a stripe across the floor. Outside, someone was walking a dog. The sounds of the street came up from below, ordinary and indifferent. She thought about what to do. She thought about it for several days, actually, turning the situation over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight, its edges. She could simply do nothing, continue as she was, let the arrangement stand, unacknowledged, indefinitely. Her sister did not know. Tyler did not know. The rent arrived on time every month. There was, in the strict sense, no problem. But she also thought about the bedroom door, the one that had not been fully closed, and the way her mother had looked at the table and said the heart doesn't always choose who we want it to choose, as if that were an answer. She did not do anything rash. That was not who she was. She simply filed the information away, the way she filed everything, carefully, in the right place, where she could find it again when she needed it. It was her cousin Patty who organized the dinner. Marta Ezra was the kind of person who believed that family problems could be solved by putting everyone in the same room, with enough food and enough line. And she had been trying to organize a family reunion for the better part of 2 years. She was persistent in the cheerful, oblivious way of someone who had not personally been hurt by any of the events she was trying to paper over. She called Marta in October, 8.5 years after the afternoon of the bedroom door. "It's been too long," Patty said. "Your mom misses you. Your dad misses you. Everyone does. Diana and Tyler are coming down from Millhaven. I thought we could all just get together, eat, talk, be normal." Marta was quiet for a moment. "When?" she said. "The Saturday before Thanksgiving. At my place. Nothing formal. Just dinner." Marta considered this. She thought about her mother, who was 63 now and had been having some health problems. Nothing serious, according to the last phone call, but enough to make distance feel less comfortable than it once had. She thought about her father, who had never been good at reaching out, but who had sent her a card on her 30th birthday with a brief note in his careful handwriting that said simply, "I think about you." She said yes. She drove down on the Saturday morning, arriving at Patty's house in the early afternoon. Patty lived in a comfortable house in a suburb south of Portland, the kind of neighborhood with wide streets and old trees and neighbors who waved from their driveways. Marta parked on the street and sat in her car for a minute, looking at the house, letting herself settle. Her parents were already inside. Her mother hugged her at the door with the particular fierceness of someone who had been waiting a long time to do it. And her father squeezed her shoulder and said, "You look well," which was his way of saying he had missed her. She felt, standing in Patty's hallway with her coat still on, something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. Diana and Tyler arrived 40 minutes later. Marta was in the kitchen helping Patty with something when she heard the front door open, and she took a slow breath and turned around. Diana was 30 years old now. She had their mother's cheekbones still, but the rest of her face had changed. There was something more careful in it, more guarded, the easy brightness of her younger years replaced by something she kept closer to herself. She was wearing a dark green dress, and her hair, was shorter than Marta remembered. Tyler had aged. He was 33 now, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome at 25 and was now merely acceptable. He had put on weight around his jaw, and there was a tension in the way he held his shoulders that had not been there when Marta knew him. He looked like a man who was tired of something and had stopped trying to name what it was. Diana saw Marta across the kitchen and went very still. Then she smiled, carefully, experimentally, like someone testing ice. "Marta," she said, "it's good to see you." "You too," Marta said, because she had decided on the drive down that she would be civil. Not warm, not cold. Civil, in the precise and considered way she was civil in every professional situation she had navigated in the past 9 years. She had learned in those years that composure was not the same as forgiveness. It was simply a choice about how you spent your energy. They sat down to dinner an hour later. Patty had made a roast and 2 kinds of salad and a bread that was slightly burned on the bottom, but good enough. The table was set with her good dishes. There was wine. There was the careful, effortful warmth of a family attempting, for a few hours, to be a family. Marta sat across from Diana. Tyler sat at the end of the table to her left. Her parents were at the other end, talking to Patty's husband about something to do with their garden. The conversation at Marta's end of the table was polite and cautious and covered safe ground: work, the drive down, the weather. She noticed that Diana and Tyler did not talk to each other much. When they did, it was brief. There was no warmth in it. There was the practiced courtesy of 2 people who had spent a long time learning to be careful around each other. She filed this away too. It was midway through the main course that Diana made the comment. She had had 2 glasses of wine. She was talking to Patty about something, laughing at something Patty had said, and then she glanced down the table at Marta and said, with a lightness that was not quite light enough, "I always thought it was funny, actually, how things worked out. Tyler and I, settled and comfortable, and Marta over there, still all business all the time. Some people just aren't made for the domestic life, I guess." She laughed. It was a small laugh, quickly done, designed to sound like nothing. The table went quiet. Marta felt her mother stiffen. She felt her father look up from his plate. She felt the particular quality of the silence that follows when someone says the thing that everyone was pretending did not need to be said. Diana held her gaze, and there was something in her eyes now. Something that had been there since she walked in the door, Marta realized. A kind of triumphalism, faint and carefully hidden. The residue of a competition Diana had decided, long ago, that she had won. Marta set down her fork. She took a sip of her water. And then, in the same even, measured voice she used when she was explaining the terms of a contract to a client who did not yet understand what they had signed, she said, "Actually, Diana, I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Diana raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Your lease," Marta said. "The apartment on Caldwell Street." A small crease appeared between Diana's brows. "What about it?" "The annual renewal comes up at the end of next month," Marta said. "I wanted you to know in advance, so you'd have time to make arrangements." The crease deepened. "Arrangements for what?" "For finding another place to live," Marta said. "I won't be renewing the lease." Diana stared at her. Tyler looked up from his plate for the first time in several minutes. "I don't understand," Diana said. Her voice had changed. The lightness was entirely gone from it now. "What does that have to do with you?" "The property on Caldwell Street," Marta said, "belongs to me. I've owned it for 6 years. Your management company sends me your rent every month." She paused. "I assumed you knew." Diana did not say anything. The color had left her face in a way that was almost physical, like watching a tide go out. Across the table, Tyler put down his fork very slowly, the way you put something down when your hands are not entirely steady. "You own our apartment," Diana said, finally. Not a question. Something between a statement and an accusation. "I do," Marta said. I've given you 30 days' notice, which is the standard period under your lease agreement. If you'd like, I can have the formal letter sent to your email this week." 30 days, Diana repeated. "There's a good rental market in Millhaven right now," Marta said in the same even tone. "You shouldn't have trouble finding something." The table was very quiet. Patty had stopped eating. Her parents were looking down the table with expressions Marta could not entirely read. Her mother with something complicated in her eyes, her father with a stillness that might have been respect. Diana opened her mouth and then closed it again. Tyler said nothing at all, and Marta picked up her fork and continued eating because the roast was good and she had driven 2 hours and she was, she realized, genuinely hungry. The drive back to Portland that evening was quiet in the particular way of drives that follow important events. Marta kept the radio off. The highway unrolled ahead of her, lit by her headlights, and the dark came down around the car. She thought about how Diana had looked in those moments after she said it. The particular quality of Diana's silence, not the silence of someone who had been defeated exactly, but of someone who had, perhaps for the first time, seen clearly the shape of something they had long preferred not to look at. There was something almost like recognition in it, as if Diana had always known, somewhere under the lightness and the laughter, that the account would eventually come due. Marta was not glad. She turned this over carefully, wanting to be honest with herself, and she found that glad was not the right word. What she felt was something more neutral than that, a kind of completion, as if a long equation had finally reached its answer. Not justice, exactly. She had learned in the years of doing property law that justice was a complicated word that rarely meant what people wanted it to mean, but something like it. She thought about her mother's face at the table, the complicated thing in her eyes. She thought she had understood it toward the end of the dinner. It was not disapproval, not quite. It was the look of a woman who had made a wrong choice a long time ago and had lived quietly with the consequences, and was now watching someone else choose differently. She thought about Tyler. He had barely spoken after she said what she said. He had eaten the rest of his dinner in a careful, private silence. And when she left, he had not said goodbye. She did not hold this against him. They had run out of things to say to each other 9 years ago, and nothing that had happened tonight had changed that. She thought about the apartment on Caldwell Street, the modest unit in the quiet residential building, with its rental history and its low vacancy rate and the reliable check that arrived on the first of every month. She had not bought it with any of this in mind. That was the part of it she kept coming back to. She had bought it because the numbers were good. She had discovered whose names were on the lease by accident. She had made her decision about the renewal slowly, over weeks, without urgency, the way she made all her decisions. There was something almost absurd about it, she thought. All of Diana's certainty, all those years. The sense that she had won something, taken something, that she was settled and comfortable, while Marta was still out there somewhere, alone and all business. And underneath that certainty, unbeknownst to her, the woman she had wronged had been quietly signing the deed on the place where she slept every night. Marta had not set out to become her sister's landlord, but she had, and she had done it simply by doing what she always did, working, building, paying attention, and being patient. The lights of Portland appeared ahead of her, scattered across the dark like something spilled and glittering. She followed the curve of the highway down toward the bridge, and across the river she could see the building where her office was, 3rd floor, window facing the water. Her window, her office, her building as of last year, having bought it from the owner who was retiring and had offered her the right of first refusal. She crossed the bridge. She thought about calling her mother and decided she would do it in the morning when there was time to talk properly. She thought about what she would say and found that she didn't need to plan it. Some conversations, she had learned, were better entered without a script. She thought about tomorrow, and the day after that, and the long, unhurried future she was building, piece by piece, in the careful, thorough way she built everything. She parked the car. She took the elevator to her apartment. She made chamomile tea because it was a habit from the years at Irene's kitchen table that she had never stopped. And she stood at the window with the mug warm in her hands and looked out at the city for a while. It was late. It had been a long day. She had things to do in the morning, a contract to review, a client call at 9, a property walkthrough in the early afternoon. She was, she realized, looking forward to all of it. She rinsed the mug, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Diana called 3 days later. Marta saw the name on her phone and let it ring once, twice, and then picked up. There was a pause on the other end. Then Diana said, "I want to understand why you did it." Marta sat back in her chair. Outside her office window, the river was moving in the afternoon light, gray and slow and indifferent. "Why I bought the property?" she said, "or why I'm not renewing the lease?" "Both," Diana said. Her voice was different from the dinner, quieter, with an edge that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow. "Either. I bought the property because it was a sound investment," Marta said. "I'm not renewing the lease because I've decided to use the unit differently." "To use it differently," Diana repeated. "Marta, yes. You've owned our apartment for 6 years and you never said anything." "You never asked," Marta said. Another pause. When Diana spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly. "Are you doing this because of Tyler? Because of what happened?" Marta considered the question. She had expected it in one form or another. "No," she said, and she meant it. "I'm doing it because it's my property and I have the right to determine how it's used. If your name had been on that lease by coincidence, someone I'd never met, I would be making the same decision." "I don't believe you." "That's your choice," Marta said. She kept her voice even. "But think about it this way, Diana. I've had your name on my rental documents for 6 years. 6 years, every month. I never raised your rent. I never made your life difficult. I did exactly what a landlord is supposed to do and nothing more. If I had wanted to hurt you, I had 6 years to do it." Silence. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," Marta said. "I'm doing it because it's time. I need the unit for something else. That's all." This was true. She had been considering converting the Caldwell Street apartment into a short-term rental for some time. The neighborhood had changed in the past 2 years, with a new development nearby bringing in a different kind of foot traffic. The numbers on a short-term rental were meaningfully better than the long-term lease. But she had also, when she finally made the decision, felt something settle in her, a quiet finality, like a door closing softly at the end of a long hallway. Not revenge, not triumph, just an ending, clean and unambiguous, that she had the right to make. "You could have told me," Diana said, "when you found out we were living there. You could have called." "Yes," Marta said, "I could have." She did not say anything else. She did not feel the need to explain the 6 years of silence, the months of paying attention, of building, of trusting that time would do its work without her having to orchestrate anything. Some things did not need to be explained. Some things simply needed to be allowed to arrive. "Are we going to be all right?" Diana asked, finally. The question was small and careful, stripped of the lightness and the performance of the dinner table. Marta thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said, "but we could be, if you want to try." Diana was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she said. It came out differently than Marta expected, not polished, not practiced, but slightly ragged, like something that had been held for a long time and was finally being put down. "For what happened 9 years ago, I'm sorry. I should have said it a long time ago, and I didn't, and I don't have a good reason why." Marta sat with the words for a moment. "Thank you," she said. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was a door held open rather than closed, and she thought that was enough for now. She found another tenant for the Caldwell Street apartment in January, a young woman named Rosa, a graduate student at the university, who signed a short-term lease and seemed delighted by the building and the neighborhood and the quiet of the street. Marta signed the new lease in her office on a Tuesday afternoon, with the river visible through the window at the familiar low angle of winter light. She signed her name, Marta Ezra, on the appropriate line, in the careful handwriting she had always had, and then she handed the paperwork to her assistant and turned back to the work on her desk. She had a full afternoon, a client meeting at 3, a property walkthrough at 5, and then the evening free, which she was thinking of spending at the small Italia restaurant 2 blocks from her apartment that she had been meaning to try for weeks. She thought about calling Irene to catch up. She thought about calling her mother, which she had been doing every Sunday now, the conversations longer and easier than they had been in years. She thought about all the ordinary things that filled her days and evenings and made up, in their accumulation, the texture of a life she had built carefully, piece by piece, without hurrying. She thought about the woman she had been at 21, sitting in a diner with coffee she couldn't drink, watching the sun go down over a parking lot with 2 bags in her car and no particular idea of what came next. She felt for that woman something that was not quite pity and not quite pride, something gentler than either, something like gratitude. That woman had done the right thing. She had picked up her bags and she had gone, and she had not looked back, not really. And she had trusted that if she kept working and kept building and kept her eyes open, something would grow that was entirely hers. Something had. She turned back to her desk. There was a contract waiting that needed her attention, and she had learned over the years that the work that needed your attention was almost always more interesting than the things you had left behind. She put on her reading glasses and began. The months after the dinner moved in the way that months move when you are too busy to track them closely, in impressions rather than dates, in the texture of days rather than their sequence. Marta expanded her practice in February. She hired a third associate, a young man named Daniel Cho, who had graduated near the top of his class from Lewis and Clark, and had a meticulous, almost compulsive attention to contract language that reminded her of herself at his age. She also brought on a paralegal named Sasha, who was efficient and dryly funny, and who reorganized Marta's filing system in her first week with such thoroughness that Marta spent a day looking for things that had been in the same drawer for 3 years. The practice was growing in the way that solid things grow, not dramatically, not in sudden leaps, but steadily, like a tree adding rings in the dark. Her reputation had spread through the Portland real estate community in the years since she started, partly through the quality of her work, and partly through the particular nature of the cases she took. She was known for being thorough. She was known for reading the fine print. She was known in certain circles for having a memory for detail that could be uncomfortable if you were on the wrong side of a negotiation. She did not take every case that came to her. She had learned early on to be selective, not out of arrogance, but out of a practical understanding that the work you chose defined you as surely as the work you did. She turned away clients who wanted to exploit technicalities simply because they could. She turned away cases that were technically legal but practically cruel. She was not naive about the fact that property law could be used as a weapon. She had seen it used that way more times than she liked. She simply chose not to use it that way herself. This made her, in some quarters, difficult. A colleague of hers named Frank Welch, a property attorney who operated in the same general space, but with considerably fewer scruples, had once said, at an industry dinner, that Marta Ezra was the most ethical person he had ever met, and it probably cost her money. He said it in the tone of someone delivering a verdict, and Marta had smiled and said she hoped so. She thought about ethics the way she thought about construction, as the foundation that determined what you could build on top of it. A weak foundation looked fine for a while, until it didn't. Spring came, and with it a call from her property manager in Millhaven, not about the Caldwell Street apartment, which was running smoothly with Rosa as the new tenant, but about the small house on the other side of the portfolio. The previous tenants had moved out in March, and there was a question about some minor renovation work before relisting. She drove down to Millhaven on a Thursday morning in April, planning to spend a few hours looking at the property and then drive back. It was a bright day, the kind of day the Pacific Northwest produces in April, as if in apology for the winter, vivid and washed and almost aggressively green. She had not been to Millhaven since she signed the original paperwork 6 years before, and she drove through the downtown area on her way to the house, curious about how it had changed. Robert Fenn had been right that the development nearby was shifting the neighborhood's character. There were new coffee shops, a bookstore that had not been there before, a restaurant with a small outdoor seating area where, despite the April chill, a few tables were occupied. The house was a modest two-bedroom on a quiet block, with a small yard that had been kept up reasonably well by the previous tenants, and a kitchen that was, as the property manager had warned her, due for some updates. She walked through it slowly, making notes, and found herself thinking about what it might look like, not as a rental necessarily, but as a place where someone could make a real home. There was something about the light in the back rooms, the way it came through the windows in the late morning, that made the space feel generous rather than small. She hired a contractor for the kitchen. She chose simple, durable materials, the kind that would wear well and look good without requiring constant maintenance. She did not overthink it. She had a tenant interested before the work was even finished. On her way out of Millhaven that afternoon, she stopped at the restaurant with the outdoor seating and had lunch alone, watching the street. The day was warm enough to sit outside comfortably if you kept your jacket on. A couple walked past with a dog. An older man came out of the bookstore with a bag. A woman pushed a stroller on the sidewalk across the street. She thought about what Diana had said at the dinner table, settled and comfortable, said with that particular lightness that was meant to convey the opposite. She thought about how Diana's version of settled had looked across the table, the careful silence between Diana and Tyler, the practiced courtesy, the tiredness in Tyler's shoulders. She thought about how her own version of settled looked from the outside and from the inside, and how rarely those two views agreed. From the outside, she knew she was the woman who had been left behind, who had walked out of an apartment with 2 bags, who had moved to a city where she knew almost no one, and had taken a job answering phones and studied law at a kitchen table. People who knew the outline of the story, and some people did, because these things got around, saw the shape of a setback, a detour, an interruption. From the inside, it had never felt like that. From the inside, it had felt like the beginning of something, the moment when the noise stopped and she could finally hear herself. She finished her lunch and drove back to Portland. She met Michael in May, through Irene, who had been trying to introduce them for the better part of a year, and who was, on this particular Saturday afternoon, hosting a small dinner party with the specific and not very subtle goal of making it happen. Michael Vance was 41 years old and taught environmental law at the university. He was tall and quiet and had the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who listen more than they speak, who ask the next question rather than filling the silence with the sound of their own voice. He was also, Marta noticed, very good at eating dinner while managing a conversation about property easements that she had not intended to turn into a professional discussion, but somehow had. "You know," he said, "most people don't bring up the rule against perpetuities at a dinner party." "Most people are missing out," she said. He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not a polite one. They talked for 3 hours. When the dinner ended and the other guests were leaving, Irene appeared at Marta's elbow with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to look smug and was finally being given the opportunity. "Well," Irene said quietly. "He's interesting," Marta said. Irene's smug expression intensified by approximately 30%. "He has your number," she said. "I gave it to him. You're welcome." He called the following Tuesday. They had coffee that Thursday. By June, they were having dinner on a weekly basis, and by July, the weekly dinners had become an unremarkable feature of Marta's life, in the way that pleasant things become unremarkable when you are not bracing for them to be taken away. She was careful, in the way that people who have been hurt are careful, not in the fearful sense, but in the precise sense, paying attention, moving at a pace that felt honest rather than urgent, saying what she meant when she said things. She found this easiness with herself, this willingness to be legible, was something she had developed in the years of solitude. When you spent enough time alone with your own thoughts, you stopped being afraid of them. You stopped hiding them, even from yourself. Michael was, she discovered, similarly legible. He had been married once, briefly, in his early 30s, and it had ended without drama. Two people who had been better friends than partners, who had recognized this eventually and separated without cruelty. He spoke about it matter-of-factly, without performing grief or performing resilience, in the way of someone who had genuinely processed something and moved on. She appreciated this. She appreciated more broadly that he seemed entirely uninterested in impressing her, which she had come to understand was a good sign. The people who tried hardest to impress her were usually the ones with the most to hide. She told him about Tyler and Diana in August, during a long walk along the waterfront on a warm evening. She told it simply, without dramatizing it, the way she would tell any story that was true but no longer raw. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long did it take," he said, "before you stopped being angry?" She thought about it honestly. "About a year," she said. "Maybe 18 months. And then it was more tired than angry. And then it was just something that had happened. And now? Now it's a story," she said. "Not mine anymore in the way it was. Just something that happened to someone." He nodded. "That's a good place to end up," he said. "It took a while to get there," she said. "Most good places do," he said. She found, walking beside him in the warm August evening, that she had read. Her mother called in September with news that was not unexpected, but was still, when it arrived, heavier than Marta had prepared for. The health problems her mother had mentioned, nothing serious, she had always said, carefully keeping her voice light, had progressed. There were tests, there were results. There was a diagnosis that was not a death sentence, but was serious in the way that certain diagnoses are serious, demanding time and attention and adjustment. Marta drove down that weekend. Her parents lived 40 minutes south of Portland, in the house she had grown up in, a modest, well-kept house on a quiet street, with a garden her father had tended for 30 years, and a kitchen that smelled, even now, like the same combination of coffee and something baked that it had always smelled like. She sat at the kitchen table with her parents and listened to her mother explain the situation in the brisk, practical way her mother had always used to manage difficult things. There was treatment. There was a schedule. There were things that would need to change for a while, and things that would probably go back to normal in time. Her father sat beside her mother and held her hand on the table, which was the most openly affectionate gesture Marta had ever seen him make in 30 years of watching him, and she felt the sight of it move through her like something warm. She came back the following weekend, and the weekend after that. She restructured her schedule. Nothing dramatic, just a rebalancing, shifting what could be shifted so that Saturdays were reliably free. She drove down each Saturday morning, had lunch with her parents, helped with whatever needed helping, and drove back in the evening. Diana called her after the third Saturday. "I heard about Mom," she said. Her voice was careful in the way it had been since their phone call in December. "I'm going to try to come down more often." "Good," Marta said. A pause. "Are you going down?" "Every Saturday," Marta said. Another pause, longer this time. Then Diana said, Maybe we'll overlap sometimes. Maybe, Marta said. They did overlap, twice in October. The first time was briefly awkward in the way that meetings between estranged people are briefly awkward. A period of adjustment, of reading the room, of small talk that had a larger weight. The second time was less so. They sat at their parents' kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about their mother's treatment, and the conversation was direct and practical, and gradually something else as well, something quieter and more familiar, like a tune you hadn't heard in years that your fingers still remembered. Diana did not bring up Tyler, and neither did Marta. Tyler was, she gathered, moving toward the periphery of Diana's life in the particular way of a relationship that has outlasted the circumstances that created it. She did not ask about this directly, and Diana did not offer it directly, but it was there in the things Diana didn't say, in the careful way she referred to home and the apartment without mentioning him. The Caldwell Street apartment, she had learned from her property manager, was still occupied by Tyler alone after Diana had moved out in January. He had found a short-term extended arrangement with the new management setup, not with Marta directly, but through the rental agency she now used for short-term leases. He was, technically, a month-to-month tenant. He could stay as long as it made sense for both sides. She had not made any decision about this. She left it to the agency. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she felt nothing particular about it. Not satisfaction, not discomfort. Just the neutral pragmatism of a landlord whose tenant was paying on time and giving no trouble. The account, she thought again, had been settled, not through any particular act of reckoning, but through the accumulation of years, hers moving one way, Diana's and Tyler's moving another, and time doing the slow, patient work of separating what needed to be separated and returning what needed to be returned. Her 30th birthday had passed without ceremony, in the middle of everything else. She had gone out for dinner with Michael and Irene and two other friends, at the Italian restaurant she had been meaning to try the previous year, and had finally tried and loved. And they had ordered too much food and a good bottle of wine, and talked until the restaurant was nearly empty. It was, she thought afterward, exactly the kind of evening she wanted. Nothing large, nothing requiring planning or performance. Just the people she had chosen and the life she had built, gathered at a table, easy with each other. She thought about 30 and what it meant, and found that it meant less to her than she had expected it to. She had spent her 20s in a kind of purposeful tunnel vision, building, acquiring, learning, moving forward with the concentration of someone who knows they are making up for lost time. Now she found herself in the strange and pleasant position of having arrived somewhere and being able to look around. She had the practice. She had the portfolio, 7 properties now, the original 4 plus 3 subsequent acquisitions, generating a reliable income that supplemented and would eventually exceed what the practice brought in. She had an apartment she loved in a city she had chosen, with a window that faced the river. She had Irene and the Saturday mornings with her parents, and Michael with his quiet attention and his genuine laugh, and his willingness to talk about property easements at dinner parties. She had Daniel and Sasha at the office, and the work she did every day, which she found genuinely interesting. She had, in other words, a life. This seemed to her, standing in her kitchen on the morning after her birthday party, making coffee in the particular golden light of a September morning, both obvious and remarkable. Of course she had a life. Everyone had a life. But there was something specific about this one, the way it had been assembled, piece by piece, from the wreckage of an afternoon when a bedroom door stood ajar, that made it feel different from a life that had simply happened to her. She had made this. Not alone. She was honest enough to know how much Irene's spare room had mattered, and Robert's patience, and the professors at the community college who had taken her seriously, and Robert Fenn, who had called about the Greenfield portfolio on a Tuesday afternoon as if it were nothing special. No one made anything entirely alone. But she had been the one who picked up the bags, and the one who drove to Portland, and the one who stayed up at the kitchen table with the textbooks spread open around her like a paper fortress, and the one who signed her name on deed after deed, year after year, building something that no one could simply take away. She poured her coffee. She stood at the window and looked at the river, which was moving in the morning light. She thought about the woman at 21, sitting in the car in the parking lot, watching the clouds. She thought about what she would say to that woman if she could. She thought she would say, "It gets interesting. It gets complicated and demanding and sometimes exhausting and occasionally strange. But it gets interesting. And the interesting parts are mostly the parts you made." She drank her coffee. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in the early morning, stirring, arriving, becoming itself again after the quiet of the night. She could hear the low sound of it from where she stood, familiar and continuous, the particular hum of a place that had become, without her quite deciding it, home. She had work to do. A client meeting at 9, a call with a contractor in Millhaven about the small house that was now rented and producing well, a draft agreement to review before the afternoon. She put down her mug and got to it. The following spring, she bought another property. It was a building this time, a small mixed-use building on the east side of Portland, 3 commercial units on the ground floor and 4 residential units above. The previous owner was retiring and had chosen her specifically, having heard from 2 separate people in the Portland real estate community that she was the kind of buyer who took care of what she acquired. She closed on it in March. She stood in the empty building on the day the keys were handed over, walking through the residential units on the upper floors with her property manager, a woman named Grace who had been working with her for 4 years and who approached buildings the way a doctor approaches patients, with observation and patience and a reluctance to draw conclusions before seeing the whole picture. The units needed work. Not structural work. The bones were good. The systems were functional. But the cosmetic layer of years of other people's choices. Paint colors that had faded oddly, flooring that had been repaired in patches, kitchens that had been updated piecemeal rather than coherently. The kind of accumulated decisions that happen when no one is holding the full picture in mind. She walked through each unit slowly, making notes, thinking about what each space needed to become what it should be. This was the part of property she had come to love most. Not the negotiations or the legal frameworks, though she was good at those, but this, the moment when you stood in a space and saw what it could be, and understood what stood between here and there, and began to plan. She thought, standing in one of the upper units with the afternoon light coming through a window that faced west, about all the spaces she had stood in like this. The apartment she had rented when she first moved to Portland, small and slightly drafty, with a radiator that clanked at night and a view of someone else's fire escape. Irene's kitchen, with the spare room just off it, where she had slept for 8 months and studied at the table and slowly assembled the pieces of a new life. The office on Morrison Street, which was hers now in a way it hadn't been when she first signed the lease. Hers in the sense that she knew every corner of it, had made decisions for every corner of it, had watched it become the thing she intended it to be. All those spaces, all those thresholds, the bedroom door that had not been fully closed. She thought sometimes about what would have happened if she had stayed, if she had found a way to set it aside, if she had been smaller than herself, or larger, or simply different, and stayed in the apartment and the relationship and the family and the city. She thought about the alternative life that might have been, the one that the girl she was at 21 might have stayed to claim. She was glad she hadn't. That was the honest thing. She was glad she had picked up the bags, because this, the building, the practice, the portfolio, the coffee at the kitchen table on a September morning, Michael's laugh, her parents' garden, Diana's careful and tentative and ongoing effort to be a sister. This was what had been waiting on the other side of the door she had walked through when she left. Not waited in the sense of being inevitable. Nothing was inevitable. She could have chosen badly in Portland. She could have given up the evening classes, the certification exams, the long nights with the textbooks. She could have spent the energy on something other than building. But she hadn't. And the thing that she had built was, she knew, inseparable from the woman she had become in the building of it. The woman who had been hurt had made the woman who could not be broken. She finished her notes. She walked back through the building with Grace, talking about timelines and contractors, about what to do first and what could wait, about the logic of sequencing renovations so that the building could begin generating income while the remaining work was completed. They locked up and stood on the sidewalk outside. The street was busy in the late afternoon. Foot traffic, a delivery truck, a couple of pigeons on the curb, doing what pigeons do. The building looked from the outside the way buildings look when they are between owners, present but waiting, holding its breath slightly. Good bones, Grace said, looking up at it. Good bones, Marta agreed. She was already thinking about what it would look like in a year. She was already, in the quiet and unhurried way she had learned to plan, building it in her mind. She walked to her car. She had a dinner reservation in 2 hours, the Italian place again, with Michael, who was, she had recently realized, someone she was going to keep, and she wanted to go home and change first. She started the car and pulled out into the street. The city moved around her, indifferent and particular, the way cities do. There was a morning in early June, about a year after the dinner at Patty's house, when Marta sat at her desk before anyone else had arrived at the office and looked at the numbers. Not with anxiety. She had learned, over years, to read financial reality without the particular distortion that anxiety produces, without either the catastrophizing that makes things look worse than they are, or the optimism that makes them look better. She looked at them the way she looked at everything important, steadily, without rushing toward a conclusion. The numbers were good. The portfolio had grown to the point where the rental income, even accounting for maintenance costs and the occasional vacancy and the property manager's fees and the mortgage payments that remained on 3 of the 7 properties, was generating enough that she could, if she wanted to, stop taking on new legal clients and live entirely on what the properties produced. She did not want to stop. She liked the work. She liked the precision of it, the way contract language had to mean exactly what it said, the way disputes resolved when you found the right argument in the right place. She liked Daniel's meticulous attention and Sasha's dry humor, and the way the office had become, over 3 years, a place with its own character and rhythm. But there was something clarifying about knowing she could, knowing that the work was now a choice rather than a necessity, knowing that the foundation she had built was solid enough to stand on without her having to maintain it constantly, like someone trying to keep a fire lit in the wind. She had read, years ago, something that had stayed with her. The idea that financial security was not about the amount of money you had, but about the ratio between what you needed and what you controlled. You could be financially precarious with a large income if your needs had grown to match it. You could be financially secure with a modest income if your life was structured correctly. She had structured hers correctly, not because she had followed a plan exactly. Plans had a way of dissolving in contact with reality, but because she had made certain consistent choices. She had kept her costs lower than her income. She had reinvested rather than spending. She had been patient about acquisitions. Not every property she looked at, only the ones with good bones, good locations, good numbers. She had been careful in the original sense of the word, full of care. It had added up. She closed the spreadsheet and turned to the contract on her desk. Daniel knocked on her doorframe at 10. He was holding 2 folders, which meant he wanted to discuss something in person rather than email it, which was always a good sign. He had good instincts about what needed conversation and what could be handled on a screen. The Hendricks property negotiation, he said, sitting down across from her. I've been looking at the counteroffer. They worked through it together for 30 minutes, trading the folders back and forth, marking up the language, finding the places where there was room and the places where there wasn't. She liked working this way, in dialogue, with someone who would push back when they disagreed and say so plainly rather than deferring. Daniel had learned this in the first month because she had told him directly that she expected it of him and had meant it. They're going to push on clause 14, she said, handing him the folder back. It's where I'd push. Thursday afternoon. Check with Sasha on my calendar. He nodded and left. Sasha appeared 30 seconds later with a coffee, which she set on the edge of the desk without comment and disappeared again. Marta picked it up and drank it, and thought about the Hendricks negotiation and the building on the east side, and the contractor's estimate that had come in 15% over what she had projected, and whether there was room in the renovation budget to absorb it, or whether something needed to be deferred. The morning moved, the office filled with its usual sounds. The low conversation from Daniel's office, Sasha on the phone with someone in the crisp, efficient voice she used for calls. The sound of the espresso machine in the small kitchen down the hall. Outside, the city went about its business, indifferent and continuous. She had lunch with Irene on a Thursday in late June at a place they both liked near the university. It was a warm day, the first genuinely warm day after a cool and rainy spring, and they sat outside at a table in the sun and ordered salads and ate slowly and talked about everything and nothing in the particular way of people who have known each other long enough that the conversation doesn't need to go anywhere. Irene asked about Michael and about the new building and about her mother's treatment, which was going well. She asked about Diana in the careful way she asked about things she was curious about but wasn't sure she should pry into. Better, Marta said, slowly. We had lunch last month, the two of us. Just lunch. She thought about it. They had met at a restaurant in the suburbs, equidistant from both of them, and they had sat across from each other and ordered food and talked, not about Tyler, not about 9 years ago, not about the dinner at Patty's or the Caldwell Street apartment. They had talked about their mother and about Diana's job, which was in marketing, and about a trip Diana had taken to Seattle in April. They had talked like two women in their early 30s who were trying to figure out how to know each other without the foundation they had both assumed would always be there. Careful, Marta said, but real. More real than I expected. That's something, Irene said. It's something, Marta agreed. She thought about what it meant. To have a sister who was also, slowly, becoming a stranger you were getting to know again. It was not the same as what they had been before. It couldn't be. Too much had happened. Too many years had gone their separate ways. But it was not nothing. It was, perhaps, something better than nothing. Something that had been built on honest ground, which was a more durable thing to build on than the ground they had started with. She thought about honesty and how it had been the consistent thread through the years since she left. The honesty she had demanded of herself in the kitchen table years, the honesty she brought to her work, the honesty she had used, finally, at Patty's dinner table, not with cruelty, but with precision. She had not performed anything that night. She had simply said what was true, clearly and completely, and let the truth do what truth does when you say it out loud. It had been enough. Tell me about the building, Irene said, refilling her water glass from the carafe on the table. The east side one. And Marta told her the bones of it, the renovation timeline, the tenants she was beginning to find for the commercial units, the small details that she found herself caring about in the particular way she always came to care about the spaces she was responsible for. She talked about it the way people talk about things they love, in more detail than was strictly necessary, finding words for things that were mostly visual and tactile, the quality of light in a certain room, the way a floor felt under her feet. Irene listened, the way Irene always listened, with genuine attention and the occasional question that showed she was following. She had been, in the 8 months after Marta arrived in Portland, the thing that Marta most needed. Someone who showed up and stayed, who didn't require anything from her except that she not disappear. Marta had tried, over the years, to tell her what that had meant, and Irene had accepted the telling the way she accepted most things, easily, without making anything larger than it needed to be. "You're happy," Irene said, when Marta had finished talking about the building. It was not a question. Marta heard it as the observation it was, and sat with it for a moment. "Yes," she said. She meant it simply, without caveat. The happiness was not the happiness of someone who had gotten everything she wanted. She had wanted, at 21, a specific future that no longer existed, and that she no longer wanted. It was the happiness of someone who had built something real, and who knew what it had cost, and who found the cost had been worth it. "Good," Irene said. She smiled, the particular smile she had that meant she was satisfied with how something had turned out. "You've earned it." The sun was warm on their table. The street moved around them. Marta drank her water and looked out at the afternoon and thought that Irene was right, and also that it was more complicated than earning, that the life she had was not a reward for the years of work, exactly, but something more intertwined with those years, inseparable from them. The work and the life were the same thing. She had built both at once. That, she thought, was the thing no one had told her at 21, when she was sitting in the parking lot with her 2 bags and her coffee she couldn't drink. That the building itself was the point, that the life you constructed in the process of trying to get somewhere was more real than the destination you were trying to reach. She had learned it slowly, the way you learn the things that matter, not in a moment of revelation, but in the accumulation of days, one after another, each one adding something small to the structure. She picked up the check. Irene protested in the way she always protested, briefly and without conviction. Marta paid it, and they walked out into the June afternoon, and the city was bright and ordinary around them. And she walked to her car with the feeling of someone who was exactly where they are supposed to be. She did not think that often. She did not think it with drama when she did. It was simply a fact, like the quality of the light, like the sound of the street, present and real, and entirely hers. She drove back to the office. There was work waiting. She was glad of it.